Welcome back to Rational Insight. So before I start today's episode, I kind of want to give a little bit of an update on the whole veganism thing. I got a gift for Christmas in that of Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, which, if you don't know, is basically the Bible of veganism. It's written by the prolific Peter Singer, who is a prominent philosopher, one of the biggest names in modern history or contemporary philosophy, and he's the pioneer or really the beginning of the movement of veganism in Australia, and he's a very well known and really very well respected author. And so far the book has been phenomenal. It's probably some pretty solid arguments that's hard to even grapple with what you could do to steelman the other side's opinion, because frankly in the last couple weeks I've been trying to find some arguments against veganism that would make most sense, and I've yet to really come across anything of compelling interest. So just thought I would update on that a bit before we get started. Today we are talking about aliens, and more specifically we're talking about aliens in their relation to Earth. Now, like most Americans, up until about a year ago, maybe a year and a half at this point, I was fairly certain that aliens were visiting Earth. I was almost... It was hard to convince me otherwise. There was, you have reports from military officials, pilots talking about this. Everyone has some type of story, or at least they know somebody with some type of story about aliens that visit Earth. And given the vastness of the universe, it seems pretty reasonable that aliens would be here. That is until I took a scientific philosophy course and metaphysics. And both of those classes really opened my eyes to the physical improbability of any extraterrestrial life reaching Earth. And that's what we're going to talk about today, whether or not it's reasonable to believe that aliens have visited Earth or that they're currently visiting Earth. So what really keyed me into this topic for this week is over the summer, the United States House of Representatives had a congressional hearing with a guy that claimed he knew that not only aliens existed, but that the government was... It's vague because, as you'll see when we get into this, he didn't give very good answers to a lot of questions and was, again, very vague with what he said, but he claimed that he was a whistleblower for the U.S. Office of the Intelligence Community Inspector General. So that case is extremely bizarre when you really think about it, that our government was having a congressional hearing about whether or not we were hiding aliens and or working with them. It's super strange, and the case itself is, no pun intended, out of this world. So I guess we could just get started there then. So some background on the case. David Grush, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, is the whistleblower in this situation, and he is a United States Air Force officer, and he's a former intelligence official. Now, in 2022, he filed a complaint with the Office of the Intelligence Community Inspector to support his plan to share classified information with the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. So his claims here, when he ended up getting this court case, or the Senate hearing, I should say, is that he claimed to have seen, this is so bizarre, claimed to see documents stating that Mussolini, the dictator during Italy's stint in World War II, that Mussolini recovered non-human spacecrafts in 1933, and that he recovered these spacecrafts. And in fact, the Vatican had even witnessed this collection of spacecraft. Now, a really big issue with this hearing is the fact that Grush, whenever he was pushed back on practically anything he said in these super outlandish statement is that he would say that he couldn't speak on it, almost that like he had to fear for his life or fear for, God knows what, for why that he couldn't speak on it. So you're going to have to bear with me, as some of the stuff he was saying was extremely bizarre. He also claimed that he had secondhand knowledge that American citizens had been harmed and killed as part of the government's efforts to cover up the information on alien spacecrafts. So in response to this, obviously NASA reiterated that there's no evidence of extraterrestrial life or their materials on Earth, and there never has been. So, again, when he gave this testimony in July, he repeated some of his claims under oath, alongside the testimony of retired U.S. fighter pilot Ryan Graves and retired U.S. Navy Commander David Fravor on their personal experiences related to UFOs. Grush testified that he could not elaborate publicly on some aspects of his claims, but he offered to provide further details to representatives in a sensitive, compartmented information facility. He claims that U.S. federal government maintains a highly secretive UFO retrieval program and possesses multiple spacecraft of non-human origins as well as corpses of deceased pilots. He complained that there was substantive evidence that white-collar crime took place to conceal these programs, and that he had interviewed officials who said that people had been killed to conceal these programs. So he's not only saying that this happened, he's claiming that he has interviewed people within this program who have witnessed these murders. He also stated that he tried to get the director of the AARO, or All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, which is an office within the United States Office of Secretary of Defense that investigates UFOs and other flying phenomena in the air, sea, or space, land. Sometimes, it's an agency used to collect things like weather balloons or some type of spy information. A similar thing happened I think it was last summer, where China had a weather balloon or a spy balloon fly over U.S. land, and it was shot down, and it was originally thought to be a UFO because people were spreading misinformation on it. And that's what this group does. Yeah, so he claimed to try to get this person to help him share his claims with Congress. And I quote here, he says, I expressed some concerns to Dr. Kirkpatrick about a year ago and told him what I was starting to uncover, and he didn't follow up with me. No surprise there. Grush elaborated on his claims in a subsequent interview with the French newspaper La Parisien. Again, I am butchering so much during this podcast, on June 7th. And he said in this interview that UFOs could be coming from extra dimensions, and that he had spoken with intelligence officials whom the U.S. military had briefed on football field-sized spacecrafts. I mean, just the idea that there would be football-sized spacecrafts flying over, populated areas, and that somehow there's no good evidence of these things. There's no good pictures. There isn't like a mass phenomena of people seeing it. It's just some guy said so. But again, we'll get into that. And that he also said that we had a crashed UFO defense contractor, and that there was malevolent activity by these UFOs. So insane. So before we get into refuting these extreme claims and what some of the experts in the field had to say about this, I think it's important to first talk about personal experiences I have with some supernatural things. Now, specifically, we're going to talk about a story that is, I guess, somewhat related to UFOs that I truly believed for many years until I developed a better epistemology and realized that it was frankly ridiculous to believe what I was believing. To try to humanize kind of this scenario, because I know a lot of people have experiences of this kind or think they do, and a lot of people believe in this type of thing. And again, this podcast isn't necessarily to completely refute this. I'm pushing back on the idea that UFOs are coming to Earth, which most people seem to think is happening. But at the end of the day, I could 100% be wrong and overturned, right? And we'll get into why that is in a bit. But to start with this personal anecdote, it was me and my friend, and this was in, I don't know, like 5 or 6 years ago now. We were in a hot tub, and while we were sitting outside for probably, I don't know, 2-3 hours, we were out there for a long time, we both had noticed this strange cloud-like thing above us, maybe an hour into being out there. Now, this thing wasn't necessarily a cloud. Again, this is how I remember it. Memory's fallible, of course, but he seems to have a very similar recollection. In that this thing seemed to be, it almost looked like it was mimicking a cloud, right? It's hard to explain what it even looked like. It was dark, of course, but it was like a night with a full moon, so you could really see the clouds moving by. And this thing, or this cloud, rather, was in the same spot for probably 40 minutes or so, and it wasn't moving. Like, other clouds were moving past this thing, and it was sitting in a very stagnant position directly above us. And I remember we were at first both kind of joking around about it, like, oh, isn't that crazy? I feel like that cloud's been here for an hour. And I remember thinking, like, wait, no, like, I definitely have seen this thing for a long time now. And then as soon as we recognized it, this thing began to move faster than the other clouds around. Now, as the young person I was obviously terrified, and I got up immediately and sprinted into my parents' house. And we came inside and just decided, it's probably best if we don't even discuss what just happened. I have some other stories, like, similarly. Those are just kind of funny to look back on now. But it's important to recognize that these things do happen and that people aren't lying, right? Like, I mean, there's definitely cases where people definitely are lying, but most of the time, people aren't lying about these experiences they have. And I hope to do an episode on ghosts in the future, too. And because everybody has a ghost story, including myself. I have a couple ghost stories. And it's important to recognize that people aren't lying about these things. It's just that humans have a tendency to attribute things that they see as bizarre to... Sometimes they anthropomorphize them. They tend to go by whatever their instincts tell them, and that is that it's, some type of ghoul or monster. And I think a big part of that is, through evolutionary psych, we know that people tend to be terrified of these things because thousands of years ago, if you heard rustling in the bushes or you saw some type of strange thing in the darkness in front of you, you recognizing that thing could be malevolent could potentially save your life, right? If there's a saber-toothed cat that's hiding in that bush, recognizing that there's something bizarre sitting there and becoming terrified of it will make you run away, and therefore more safe, more likely to survive. Today we don't have saber-toothed cats, and most people, even if they are in the wilderness, will have some type of gun to protect themselves. So these genes have evolved in a way that we might see something that is bizarre and immediately attribute that to the supernatural. Now, in the case of this cloud thing, what I think is probably most likely is there was a similar cloud above my head when I first recognized it. I didn't look for a while, and then when I looked again, there was another cloud that was very similar to that one above me, and perhaps even when I saw this cloud and he mentioned that, I thought, oh yeah, I saw a cloud like that like 40 minutes ago. But in all reality, I may not even have seen a cloud like that 40 minutes ago. It was just I was attributing it to that because he was saying it, and I thought, that sounds great. Now, as for it to start to move right when we recognized it, the fact of the matter is, clouds move differently all the time, right? They're not moving like just parsimoniously at all times in one direction at one speed. They move at different speeds all the time. And, I may recognize now that it probably wasn't sitting at a standstill directly above my head, and then just when I noticed it started to move away. And we're going to get into why it's more reasonable to suggest that than it is that it was just a, alien craft above my head or some type of like demonic entity above me or something bizarre like that. But I think it's just cool to share a personal anecdote and show why that it's pretty reasonable to believe in these things or to suspect that people are having these experiences, because even, someone, I consider myself a pretty skeptical person, and I was utterly convinced of this for years. So to return back to the case here of Congress from last year, some of the relevant experts in the field commented on the case, right? Because this was a big deal. You have the U.S. government actually sitting in on what could be a huge whistleblow to, what many people think that Area 51 is housing aliens. And this could be a huge deal to finally break through and have the U.S. government admit that they're lying to us. So Adam Frank is a professor of astrophysics from the University of Rochester. And he said that he does not find these claims to be exciting at all, because they are just hearsay, where a guy says he knows a guy who knows another guy who heard from a guy that the government has alien spaceships. A pretty harsh way of putting it, but probably true nonetheless. Frank also said that Grush's account is that it's a extraordinary claim and that it requires extraordinary evidence, and that there's none which we're getting. And he added at the interview there, I thought was pretty funny. He said, "Show me the spaceship." Which, he has a really good point there. If you're going to claim that there's this grandiose system happening within the government that's protecting people, or sorry, not protecting people, attacking people and killing people over these aliens that we've encountered on Earth, there's got to be some type of evidence, right? You can't just say that someone who's seen this, some guy that says he's seen this, or that you'll have your friend testify, even if they're a military official, testify that they've seen aliens as well. Like, we're going to need some type of substantive claim. Like, where are these spacecrafts that if they have them, have you not gotten any pieces of these spacecraft? Like, there's got to be pictures, something. You can't just come on stage and say that, oh, I have more, but I'm not going to tell you. That's just ridiculous, right? So next we have a history professor from Penn State University named Greg Eghian. I hope I'm saying that right. This is just getting worse as we go on. And he's an expert in the history of UFOs as it occurs in the context of public fascination, which is a really cool thing to do. I can't believe that's like an actual profession. But he notes that there have been many instances over recent decades in the U.S. of people who have previously worked in some type of federal department coming forward and making bombshell accusations about the truth regarding UFOs, with the whistleblower claims by Grush fitting this pattern. He also describes that during the 40s and 50s, enthusiasm about flying saucers and comments that the successful books on the subject by authors David Keyhole, Frank Scully, and Gerald Hurd provided the model for a new kind of public figure, the crusading whistleblower dedicated to breaking the silence over alien origins and unidentified flying objects. So it's important to recognize, I'm not going to get too much into this specific case here, but during the Roswell incident, which if you don't know is something that happened in, I want to say it was 1947, but it was sometime during the 40s. A farmer claimed to have seen a spacecraft with little gray aliens dead in it in his ranch, and then the FBI came the next day, took them, and immediately swept them out of there. Now, if you go to Roswell now, there's actually a museum for this that I saw videos of. And in the actual museum, they have a small little section at the end where it's like, basically shows that the thing they recovered, and they have pictures of it, was just some type of like weather device. Like, it was very obviously a weather device, and there was no little green aliens or little gray aliens or anything like that. It was just some type of weather device. And even if it was like some type of spy thing, during the Red Scare, so it could have just been some type of spy equipment that the U.S. government didn't want people finding, which is much more reasonable to believe than there was these, I don't even know, like these extraordinarily advanced beings that came here, somehow crashed, somehow died, looked very similar to Earth beings, and then they were swept away by the government. Nothing came of it. Somehow these little gray aliens didn't have friends that came looking for them, right? Like I would imagine if you have that powerful of engineering that you could get to Earth, it would be really bizarre that they crashed, but it would be so much more bizarre that no one came to recover them at all. Like they just kind of were like, that's just it. And somehow the U.S. government was good enough to keep it hidden. But yeah, it's important to recognize, and I think that's what this professor is getting at, is that during that time, this sort of claim started becoming very prevalent. He also stated that Grush's story ups the ante, and it's very hard to take seriously unless we start getting some real evidence that's of a fascinating nature to prove these things, right? So, again, another relevant expert claiming that there's no evidence here and that probably shouldn't even be taking it seriously. So another person here is a representative, Mike Turner, chairman of the House of Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, said that every decade there's been individuals who said the United States has such pieces of unidentified flying objects that are from outer space, and that there's no evidence of this, and certainly it would be quite a conspiracy for this to be maintained, especially at this level. Senator Lindsey Graham found that the claims were unreasonable, saying that if we really found this stuff, there'd be no way you could keep it from coming out. This is a really important point. Whenever I hear these grandiose claims or these huge conspiracies, and I'm planning on doing multiple episodes on conspiracies because some of them are just so unbelievably, trying to find a better word for this, but for lack of a better term, just stupid. Genuinely just stupid to believe in. I mean, some of these claims, you would have to deny so much of what we understand about everything and so much of the evidence that we have to peddle something that, at the end of the day, doesn't even make sense. And this is another one of these scenarios, right? You're talking about the government can't keep anything to themselves, right? Even now, with Grush here, or Grush, whatever, at this Congress meeting, he isn't even a part of these groups he's claiming to whistleblow. And he's coming out and talking about it. And you're going to tell me that no one in the last 100 years that this has been supposedly happening, from Mussolini in 1933, in the last 100 years, there hasn't been a single person to come out with some type of evidence to show that this was happening, that they were literally killing American citizens to protect this lie. No one has come forward. How is that possible? You would have to believe that they're somehow getting all of these people to keep quiet, that they didn't tell any of their family members, no friends, they didn't slip out when someone was drunk one night. Or maybe you believe that the government's like killing these people if they tell anyone. But even if that's the case, then you would have to explain why there's not a bunch of missing people in these spaces. Like, there's just so much. And we're going to get to like the physical problems of aliens visiting Earth. But even just on like a common sense level, human beings cannot keep secrets at all. I mean, go tell your best friend something you don't want to getting out, like something very serious you don't want to get out, and in weeks you're going to find out that like 10 people know about it. So that the idea that like the government's just silencing all these people is just so baseless. It's not even funny. So now to move forward a bit here, I'm going to move into some of the issues with believing something like this. And first we're going to start with eyewitness testimony, and then we're going to move into the physical issues, right? So to start with eyewitness testimony, I'm going to base most of what I'm going to say here on David Hume's On Miracles. And the reason for that is Hume's work is still regarded as some of the best on why we should never believe in a miracle. Now, a miracle in this case is being defined as some type of extraordinary, grandiose, supernatural claim that is being attested to either divine or magical, or even in this case, alien superstition, that the only explanation has to be one of those things. So the only evidence Grush has for these claims is on eyewitness testimony. And to start with, Hume's argument here is that it is never reasonable to believe in a miracle based on human testimony. Even in cases in which there are relatively strong human testimony, so corroborating evidence, let's say you have multiple people saying the same thing, this evidence is always going to be outweighed by the evidence that emerged from our ordinary experience of life in the physical world. He had the famous quote there of, "I've never seen water turn to wine or a dead person come back to life," and that it's exceptionally rare for something like that to happen, or that it doesn't happen at all. And when there's contradictory evidence, whichever has more proof supporting it should be the one we accept. So, in this situation specifically, with Grush, we've already talked about some of the many flaws in what he's doing here. But we could also just be very simple and say, what is more likely here? That Grush has been fed false information. Grush has claimed to see things that have better and more reasonable explanations too, such as documents that Mussolini was capturing aliens or whatever. It's much more likely that that's just false or misrepresented than it is that that actually happened. So to move forward a bit here, for eyewitness testimony to be valid, says Hume, it requires several implications. So for one, our memories must be infallible. Otherwise, fallibility can create distortions, lessening the eyewitness's validity. And another essential point that must be true for eyewitness testimony to work is that men must be honest. Because if not, we have no reason to believe that something is based on another person's statement. Finally, men also must be immune to delirium or psychosis. If not, our reality might be inaccurate and our perception faulty. So think about what's happening here. We know that human beings can lie. We know that human beings can have faulty memory. We also know that people are prone to delusions and psychosis. All three of those things are true, and they're corroborated by empirical data. What is more likely then? That someone along this chain of events that Grush is claiming lied, was misinformed, remembers the details improbably, or someone was delirious. All of that versus the idea that there's this grandiose conspiracy happening, that they're breaking all of these physical laws, which we'll get to in a second, and that they're somehow being held quiet and hidden from the public by the government. It's really easy to see which option is more likely here. And to push on this even further, the evidence that aliens have visited the Earth has never been repeated, and in fact it's been debunked hundreds, maybe even thousands of times now. There's been claims that people have absolute proof, and this is the best evidence you'll ever see for aliens. I mean, just go on the History Channel and you'll see all day long like programs on this of people talking about it. And again, I don't think they're lying most of the time. And they've been debunked over and over and over again. I mean, we already talked about Roswell. And that incident was huge. And it was debunked. Why would I believe that? And Roswell's just one incident. Like, you can go online and there's hundreds of cases of this that have been debunked. There's even cases of like seasoned airplane pilots not realizing that they were detecting things underneath their ship that they said were alien spacecrafts that were mimicking their movements, that were just the reflection in the water. Seasoned aircraft pilots can make these mistakes. What does that mean for someone like you or me? it's so much more likely that these things are explanations for the phenomena and not actually these grandiose claims. Grush could easily be wrong about what he's saying. I mean, take his claim that non-human biologetics have been retrieved from these clash sites. Biologetics are not bodies, necessarily, but even if they were, the program would have to have DNA to confirm that this is alien origin. And that would be a huge deal. But also, even if they were able to find this DNA was non-human, it could easily be an animal. Or perhaps one of the sources might have been convinced that some piece of biological material they were asked to evaluate was alien origins, but it was simply because they couldn't figure out what it was. Like maybe it was contaminated, mishandled, incomplete, damaged, otherwise faulty. And this has probably happened multiple times. But Grush is claiming here that this biologetics is proof of aliens. Now that right there is an appeal to ignorance, right? It's a fallacy to believe that because we can't provide evidence to show what it is, it must be this. Or we don't have evidence to the contrary, so therefore it is this. It's a very similar concept to the God of the Gaps fallacy, in which there's some type of phenomena that happens and we can't explain what it is, so therefore it must have been God that created it. It's not a good form of logic, and it needs to be dispelled. Some people have posited that there's no way Grush would lie about this because he could be held for contempt in Congress. But contempt in Congress is a relatively light sentence. I mean, at most it's a year in jail and $100,000. And I mean, people are going to say $100,000 is a lot, which it is, but for someone like Grush, who could sell books off of this and get his name out there, could easily make more money than that and actually still make a profit. I mean, look at the guy that defied the subpoena in the January 6th investigation, Steve Bannon, and he only had to pay $6,500 and spend 4 months in jail. It really isn't this huge deal for someone to lie in court. It's not as magnificent as we otherwise may think. So now we're going to move into what I think is the most compelling argument against aliens being on Earth, and that is the physical improbability of them being able to reach us. Now, to be clear, I am by no means an expert on physics. I have a very basic understanding of astrophysics, and I'm going to try my best to relay this information, but you should really do your own research here and figure this out for yourself. Now, it's really likely that aliens exist. Almost no astrophysicist or scientist in general, which I'm not sure how relevant that would be even, but most would agree that it's almost unequivocally true. Aliens probably exist. Now we know this from the Drake equation, which is a probabilistic argument used to estimate the number of active commutative extraterrestrial civilizations in the Milky Way galaxy. So the probability of how many advanced life forms there are in the Milky Way galaxy, which is massive in of itself. So to explain the Drake equation, it essentially goes like this, that n, the number of civilizations in the Milky Way galaxy with which communication may be possible, and r, the average rate of star formation in our galaxy, f, the fraction of those stars that have planets, n, the average number of planets that could potentially support life per star that has planets, f1, the fraction of planets that could support life that actually develop life at some point, f2, the fraction of planets with life that actually go on to develop intelligent life, f3, the fraction of civilizations that develop a technology that releases detectable signs of their existence into space, L, the length of time for which such civilization will release detectable signals into space. So that's essentially the Drake equation. that's basically trying to assess how likely it is that there's life in the galaxy, which is again massive, and what likeliness that there is that those extraterrestrial life forms would be intelligent and able to send communicative means into the galaxy, right? So it's really important to recognize how vast the universe is, right? And to explain this, I'm going to read something here to help maybe put it into perspective. The observable universe is a ball-shaped region of the universe comprising all matter that can be observed from Earth, or its space-based telescopes and exploratory probes at the present time. So the electromagnetic radiation from these objects has had time to reach the solar system and Earth since the beginning of the cosmological expansion. Essentially what that's saying is that the observable universe is everything that we can see, either from here or from any type of technology we've put out into the solar system. And I believe we've gone beyond at this point, but still. And the word observable in this sense doesn't actually refer to the capability of like modern technology to detect light or other information for an object, or whether there's anything actually to be detected. It refers to the physical limit created by the speed of light itself. So I guess it actually goes beyond what I was saying. It's like what's observable from Earth. It's actually what is able to be observed hypothetically through the means of the speed of light, right? How far could light actually be detected? And this is where we're getting into some strong physical issues. And you get into metaphysical problems here as well when we start talking about the speed of light. Because you start getting into issues of, time dilation, time problems in it of itself. So I'm trying to explain this light year thing as adequately as possible, or speed of light, sorry, as adequately as possible, which is the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. And the only thing that can go, according to Einstein's relativity, the only thing that can go the speed of light are massless particles, including photons, which make up light and travel at that speed. And it's impossible to accelerate to any material object up to that speed of light because it would take an infinite amount of energy to do so. As hard as that is for me to wrap my mind around, essentially what it is getting at here is that no physical properties could move the speed of light. And even if you were to get close to, let's say, 99% of the speed of light, which is theoretically possible, it would require an amount of energy unfathomable to the human race. Now, to be fair, perhaps aliens have figured out a way around this, but the way we see it right now, it's really, really unlikely that anyone would be able to find the type of technology necessary to go the speed of light. Actually, it would be impossible to do that as of now in terms of the physics we understand, but even to get close to that would be so unbelievably unlikely, right? Like I said, once you get here, you start to get into some really bizarre time issues. So, once you start moving faster than the speed of light, the more faster it goes, the more massive it gets, and finally, the more time slows, which if you were to go to the speed of light, time would stop altogether, which is a massive paradox in itself, which is completely beyond the scope of this podcast, or this episode, rather. And maybe I'll talk about that in the future, some of the time issues, because that can be pretty interesting philosophically. But it's just important to realize here how unbelievably unlikely it is to move that fast and what it would actually mean to do that. So let's humor this, right? Let's humor the idea that potentially aliens have figured it out. They have reached levels of intelligence we couldn't even comprehend, and they've reached levels of technology that we can't even comprehend. The nearest star to us is a low mass star called Proxima Centauri. And this star has a solar system that could potentially have life on it. At least scientists, NASA has declared that it could potentially have life on this somewhere in the solar system. Now, this solar system is 4.2 light years away. And a light year is essentially the unit of length used to express astronomical distances to equal to exactly 5.88 trillion miles per year. And that would only be if you're moving at the speed of light. So you would travel 5.8 trillion miles per year if you were moving at the speed of light. And if you were even able to do that, it would still take 4 years to reach this solar system, which is the closest one to us that could have life. Now, remember, moving at the speed of light, as we know it now, would fundamentally disrupt everything we know about physics. And some people may appeal to the fact that science has been wrong in the past, and perhaps these extraterrestrial life forms have just figured out a way of dismantling how we understand physics, and perhaps we've just been wrong about it. But I want to make sure we remember here, that's not how science works. People often appeal to us finding new studies that contradict with old studies, and we throw out old information for the new. That's not actually true. There's never been a case in modern history of science, of empiricism, in which we had a formula or some type of structure within science in which that structure was completely thrown out for something new. So a good example of this was Newtonian theory. Newton's theory was and still is very effective and very competent. But it came to a point where Einstein's theory was contradicting with some of the things Newtonian theory had predicted. And in these cases, relativity would take over. But again, it wasn't that Newtonian theory was just completely wrong and that relativity completely reshaped how we understood things. It built upon Newtonian theory. It built upon what we already knew and explained some things that we otherwise weren't able to explain with Newtonian theory. Now, you could argue that something like quantum mechanics, in which we don't understand much of anything, like especially things like dual role particles, or even some issues you get with particles arriving in the same spot at the same time, or the issue of visibility, in which particles will collapse upon being seen and otherwise will act completely differently. These things might be explained by some further hypothesis or further theory that we haven't gotten to yet. But that wouldn't contradict what we already know. Whereas moving the speed of light would completely contradict Einstein's theory. And relativity, to this point, has been massive in scope, but also in replicability, it's been great, right? I mean, relativity, poised with many different tasks, has come out on top time and time and time again. And that would mean that we somehow have a complete misunderstanding of physics, and it would have to be explained how it would be possible that we had the theory of relativity that stated these things were going to happen in the way that they did, and then when we tested them, they did do that. But yet it's still completely wrong. You would have to be completely wrong to move at the speed of light, or even get close to the speed of light. So let's say that these aliens had technology similar to ours, but let's say they were going to use all their resources to reach us. Now, if they had similar technology to ours, modern, the highest tech we have, let's say that economic problems weren't even there, these aliens just really wanted to come here. That being said, it would take them 6,300 years just to get here. I mean, really think about that. 6,300 years. Human beings have only been writing things down for approximately that time. 6,000 years ago, you're looking at civilizations that were barely architectural or agricultural. Think about how long that is. And we're suggesting that these aliens are traversing that, somehow living that entire time, having the energy to do that, getting here, and then occasionally these things are crashing and being controlled by the United States government. I mean, what a ridiculous claim, seriously. Now, it could be the case that they have higher technology than us, but even if they had thousands of years more advanced technology than us, we're still looking at hundreds of thousands of years here to just get here, not even get here and come back. So, this brings us to another issue. The Fermi paradox. And this paradox is essentially that there's a discrepancy between the lack of conclusive evidence of advanced extraterrestrial life and the likelihood that they exist. So it's, again, we already discussed, it's extremely likely, given the vastness of the universe, given the fact that the universe has an expansive rate that we can't even comprehend. I mean, there's just the observable universe, and then there's dark matter and things that go so far beyond that. I mean, think of it this way. There's billions upon billions of galaxies, and the closest galaxy to us is 25,000 light years away. The universe is massive. It's extremely likely that life exists. So it's pretty strange that we don't have any evidence of it actually being here. And not even being here, but even giving signals to us. Because we're putting out signals constantly. And we're not getting anything back. Right? I mean, there's billions of stars in the Milky Way that are similar to our sun, that have a high probability of having some type of Earth-like planet in their circumstellar habitable zone. You would think it'd be likely at this point that they at least figured out a way to maybe not even travel, but to send messages that far into the galaxy to reach us. But there's no convincing evidence whatsoever that this has happened. Now, there's some answers to this issue here, because this is essentially another argument for alien life, right? Like, if they really did exist, we would see something, and that's why people are postulating or positing that we have seen things, and that's where you get all these different type of conspiracies, right? But one of the answers in the opposite direction for why this is the case is the rare Earth hypothesis, which is basically stating that it's kind of like the teleological argument that the Earth is fine-tuned for life, and it's extremely unique in that it's in its likelihood of creating life. The problem is that it's a really anthropomorphic way of looking at things, right? Like we're assuming that things only evolve in the way that they do on Earth, and that these things would act the way that we do and be intelligent as us. Because think about it, if these aliens do exist, and let's say that they're on these near stars, even if that's the case, they would not only have to exist, they would have to evolve extremely far to be extremely intelligent, to get to the point where we are, after billions of years on this Earth, humans have finally there's finally been an organism to the point that we're at. They would have to get to that point, or even essentially be further than us, because we can't reach them either. So it's pretty, it's really just hard to grasp the scope of how unlikely it would be to reach any of these other aliens, even if they existed. They would have to not only pass all those bars I just said, but they also would have to have existed at the same time as us, or at a time in which light traveled and reached us, right? Let's say they put it out and then it traveled for hundreds of light years and then got to us at this time. Because remember, we've only had radio signals for over 100 years or so now. So even if they sent it and it got here 1,000 years ago, we would have no way of knowing it. And it's hard to know that, even if we were listening, we haven't been listening for long. And even if we are listening, who knows if we're even listening right? We're looking for signals. Who knows if aliens would even give signals in the same way that we would be able to transcribe them? Who's to say that they would even have senses, right? These things could evolve in completely different ways, or might not even be carbon-based beings, right? This could be a completely different system in which there'd be no way to communicate. So to wrap up this episode, I want to kind of move into some more common sense issues here that I thought are pretty funny and pretty easy to see why it's so ridiculous to really think that these are happening, right? There are reported hundreds of UFO sightings and UFO crashes every year. The United States civilian aircraft have about 1,200 crashes a year. Now, if you do the rates here, how many crashes per flight, it would seem to be the case, given that aliens are here. So let's do the math here. Like 500 alien sightings, let's say, or crashes, and then 1,200 aircraft per however many flights are done each year. These extremely intelligent, extremely advanced beings are reportedly crashing more than we are. I mean, think about how ridiculous that would be. I mean, again, it's possible, but it's just so unbelievable. Another thing here to remember is people tend to remember the hits and forget the misses. This is a heuristic that people have, in which in their mind they remember, I had this experience with aliens, but they forget about the, thousands of other times they either believed in or heard about or seen alien stories that were debunked, and just completely kind of throw that out the window and grasp onto this one thing that they see as real. Another thing here is the fact that I was kind of talking about this a second ago, these aliens always tend to be kind of human-like or Earth-like, right? Like, you'll see people talk about, like, this alien spaceship, it was this big V with, like, 10 lights on it. Why would, if aliens existed and evolved completely different than us, why would they have, like, this spaceship that's, like, kind of relatively similar to some stuff we have going on, like a stealth jet, right? A fighter plane, I think that's what they're called. I'm obviously butchering that, but we have things that look similar to that. Why wouldn't it just be the case that maybe that's what's happening? Instead of, automatically throwing out everything and saying it must be extraterrestrial life. Again, we have horrible perception. Like I already said, I gave this in my own testimony, right? Like, a lot of times we see things that just aren't true. And without going down a whole rabbit hole of how human perception is very poor, think about the last time you were reading a book or studying at a desk or in a library, and you noticed a friend out of the corner of your eye. You saw someone, maybe you were expecting to see them, or maybe you weren't, and you saw a friend or an animal or something in the corner of your eye, and then you look up and there's nothing there. Our brains trick us constantly. Most of the things you see are an illusion of your brain trying to fill in the gaps and do the work for your eyes so it doesn't have to process what it's seeing. We already talked about the evolutionary explanation for why people might be seeing aliens, but this is another explanation, right? It's just a simple illusion of sight of what people see. There's been stories even of whole towns of people seeing these like grandiose lights above their town, that these balls of light that are incomprehensible and they must be extraterrestrial. But when you really look into it and you find out that it's just like, the United States was just shooting up flares, or they had some type of like light show going on that's completely reasonable, or there's some type of natural phenomena that happened that's completely reasonable to believe, right? We seem to always go to these things, and if you have a good epistemology, a good way of basing your thoughts and your knowledge on things, it's always best to accept what's more reasonable, what we already know, whatever the simple answer is, to accept Occam's razor, right? If I see lights in the sky, instead of immediately attributing that to extraterrestrial life, it's much more reasonable to assume that is just some natural phenomena, whether it be military or the Earth producing some type of light, maybe northern lights or volcanic ash or something like that, obviously depending on where you live. But it's much more likely for something like that to be the case than it is that all of the laws of physics have just been broken and there's an alien here, and that I'm seeing it. And again, if this alien was here, if it didn't want me to see it, the odds are I wouldn't see it, right? If it was really that advanced, what is the likelihood that I would be able to to capture it, right? So without beating this topic to death, I think that's a good spot to end the podcast on. Let me know what you think. I could 100% be swayed on this with some contradictory evidence, perhaps. This isn't a final clear-cut thing. I could be wrong 100%. So, leave a message, text me, or email me, leave a message on the Spotify thing or a comment on YouTube, and let me know what you think. Do you think aliens have visited us? Do you have some type of evidence for this that you think people aren't looking at? I'd be really curious to hear it. I plan on starting to do these podcasts every Sunday. I know this is getting released on a Friday, but I didn't want to release one on New Year's. I'm going to be very busy, and I'm sure most people will be too. So I'm going to release this one on Friday, but in the future, look forward to Sunday releases. And please leave some type of response or criticism. I'm trying to make this as enjoyable as possible, and I can only do that through the feedback of the viewers, so leave a rating, a comment or so, and let me know what you think. And yeah, so next week, I'm not sure what I'm doing yet. I have a couple ideas. Again, if you have anything that you think I should do specifically, you can always reach out to me. But other than that, thanks for listening today. I had fun talking about this as an interesting topic, and I'll see you in the next one.